As I keep reminding myself through every challenge, no matter what I'm facing, my faith will always stand stronger than my fear, and I choose to believe in myself even when the world feels uncertain. But just as that quiet inner resolve holds steady, a storm has erupted on the outside, triggered by a shocking revelation from a veteran journalist that has sent tremors straight through the heart of the crown. Suddenly, the legitimacy of the Sussex children is being questioned in the most explosive way possible, with surrogacy allegations spreading like wildfire and threatening to strip Archie and Lilibet of their rightful place in the line of succession. The situation escalates rapidly as social media dives into a frenzy, analyzing every past image, every public appearance, and especially every baby bump photo, turning speculation into a global spectacle. The monarchy, already under intense scrutiny, now finds itself entangled in one of the most damaging controversies it has ever faced, as whispers grow louder and accusations become bolder. Yet, what truly shocks the world isn't just the scale of the allegations, but the response from the very person at the center of it all. From her lavish Montecito mansion, Meghan Markle chooses complete silence, offering no statements, no clarifications, and most critically, no documents that could instantly settle the matter. This silence doesn't calm the storm, it fuels it, allowing public opinion to spiral out of control and tear into the dignity of the royal bloodline. Inside the palace, tension rises sharply as every attempt to control the narrative seems to backfire, making it appear as though there is something to hide. But while uncertainty grips the institution, one figure refuses to bend under pressure. Princess Anne, known for her unwavering resolve, steps forward with a different approach entirely, determined not to play along with speculation or public pressure. Instead, she focuses on one thing, the truth, and more specifically, the one piece of evidence that could settle everything once and for all: the original medical records. As questions swirl, a deeper mystery begins to take shape. Is Meghan's silence the reaction of someone unfairly targeted, holding back out of pain or principle, or is it something far more calculated, a deliberate move designed to manipulate both the media and the monarchy itself? That uncertainty hangs heavily in the air, building tension with every passing moment. And as Princess Anne moves closer to uncovering what's hidden, the stakes become even higher, because once that sealed file is opened, whatever truth lies inside won't just answer questions. It could completely redefine the narrative, exposing something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined and setting the stage for consequences that could shake the very foundation of the royal family. The entire chain of events didn't begin with an explosion or a dramatic announcement, but rather with a single ominous headline that appeared quietly on the front page of one of the largest tabloids on the East Coast, a headline so carefully crafted that it carried more weight than any confirmed report ever could. There was no byline attached, no direct accusations clearly stated, and yet every word seemed intentionally sharpened, arranged like hidden blades designed to slip past censorship and cut directly into the most sensitive nerve of the British royal family, the line of succession itself. The article didn't claim anything outright, but instead pointed toward what it described as the untold shadows behind the delivery room doors of the Duchess of Sussex, a phrase so vague yet so provocative that it instantly ignited curiosity across the globe. Within moments of publication, the media landscape began to shift, as readers, analysts, and commentators started dissecting every implication hidden between the lines. What followed was a calculated breakdown of inconsistencies, presented not as accusations but as unanswered questions that demanded attention. The article highlighted what it called blind spots surrounding both of Meghan's pregnancies, raising concerns that had never been publicly addressed before. It questioned why, during the final months, no royal doctors were reportedly involved, a detail that stood out given the strict traditions usually followed within the monarchy. Then it moved to visual evidence, pointing out how candid paparazzi photos appeared to show her baby bump changing in size in ways that seemed inconsistent over short periods of time, an observation that, whether accurate or not, was enough to spark widespread speculation. But the most powerful moment came at the end, where the article posed a single, devastating question directly to the public. Were Archie and Lilibet truly born from Meghan Markle herself, or could they be the result of a highly confidential, multi-million-dollar surrogacy arrangement hidden from the world? That question alone was enough to trigger a chain reaction that no one could control. In the world of royalty, where tradition and legality are tightly intertwined, the rules surrounding succession are absolute, leaving no room for ambiguity. A child's position in the royal line depends not just on lineage, but on the legal requirement of being born from the body of the recognized mother. If that condition is not met, the consequences are immediate and irreversible, effectively removing that child from the historical record of succession. This is why the speculation carried such destructive potential, because if proven true, it wouldn't just be a personal matter, it would fundamentally alter the structure of the monarchy itself. Within hours, the rumor spread at an unprecedented scale, transforming social media into a chaotic battleground of theories, debates, and emotional reactions. Millions of searches flooded the internet, while countless posts began analyzing even the smallest details of Meghan's past appearances, turning old footage into evidence for both sides of the argument. Videos of her walking in high heels late into her pregnancy were slowed down and scrutinized, while photographs were zoomed in to highlight folds in her clothing that some claimed were unnatural. The public quickly divided into opposing camps, with one side demanding immediate action and questioning the children's titles, while the other fiercely defended Meghan, accusing the media of launching a cruel and baseless attack. As this digital storm intensified, global attention shifted toward the quiet Montecito mansion hidden behind trees in California, where the world waited anxiously for a response that never came. People expected a statement, a denial, or even a simple piece of proof like an ultrasound image that could silence the noise instantly. They anticipated a strong, emotional reaction from a mother defending her children. But instead of clarity, they were met with complete silence. A silence so heavy that it only deepened the mystery and made the unfolding situation even more explosive. Inside the sunlit yet eerily still living room of the Montecito mansion, Meghan stood motionless in front of a massive flat-screen television as breaking news alerts flashed endlessly across the screen, each headline amplifying the growing storm surrounding her children. The room itself felt calm, almost too calm compared to the chaos unfolding outside, but that calm carried a strange, calculated stillness. On the table nearby, her phone vibrated non-stop, lighting up again and again with incoming calls from media representatives, influential friends, and even encrypted numbers from London, each one signaling urgency, pressure, and expectation. Yet she made no move to answer any of them. There was no visible panic on her face, no sign of distress or desperation, just a cold, controlled expression, her eyes steady and unreadable, as if she had already anticipated every possible outcome. In her hands, she held something far more powerful than any statement she could release, a thick manila envelope, its surface marked with the bright red embossed seal of one of California's most prestigious maternity hospitals. That envelope contained exactly what the entire world was demanding to see: original medical records, detailed fetal heartbeat charts, delivery room documentation, and official birth certificates signed in ink by the attending obstetrician. It was undeniable, physical proof, the kind that could instantly crush every rumor and restore her children's honor in a single moment. All she had to do was open it, take a simple photo, and share it publicly, and the entire narrative would collapse. But she didn't. Instead, she slowly traced her finger along the edge of the envelope, a faint, almost calculating smile forming, as if she understood the weight of what she held and the power of withholding it. Without hesitation, she turned away from the television and walked toward an antique oak cabinet tucked neatly in the corner of the room. Opening the lower drawer, she carefully placed the envelope beneath a stack of ordinary-looking papers, hiding it in plain sight before quietly locking it away. The soft click of the key echoed through the otherwise silent space, marking a decision that would shape everything that followed. This wasn't the silence of someone confused or overwhelmed, it was deliberate, controlled, and strategic. Meghan understood something fundamental about public attention: that curiosity, once ignited, grows stronger in the absence of answers. By choosing not to respond, she wasn't letting the situation spiral out of control. She was allowing it to evolve exactly as she intended. If she had immediately denied the claims, the story would have faded quickly, losing its momentum before it could reach its full impact. But by withholding the truth, she created a vacuum, a space where speculation could thrive, multiply, and spread without limits. In that vacuum, conspiracy theories would take root, public emotions would intensify, and pressure would mount on the royal family to react. Her goal wasn't to stop the fire. It was to let it burn, to push it further until it reached the very doors of the monarchy. She wanted the royal family to be forced into a response, to step forward and question their own bloodline, to publicly engage with something they could neither confirm nor deny without risking their credibility. And in that moment of forced reaction, she would shift the narrative entirely, positioning herself not as the subject of suspicion, but as a wronged figure pushed to the edge by the very institution she had once been part of. What appeared to the world as silence was, in reality, a carefully constructed strategy, one that turned uncertainty into leverage and speculation into a powerful tool. A complex and calculated game had begun, where perception mattered more than truth, and where even the reputation of innocent children could become part of a much larger, far more dangerous narrative. A full week passed after the article first appeared, and instead of fading away, the controversy only grew stronger, expanding into something far more intense and uncontrollable than anyone had anticipated. The silence from Montecito, which at first seemed like a temporary pause, had now transformed into the most powerful and dangerous element of the entire situation. In the psychology of public opinion, especially when accusations reach such a serious level, silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is often seen as confirmation. As the days went by without any denial or clarification, more and more people began to assume that there must be truth behind the claims, because if there wasn't, why not simply prove it? That single question echoed everywhere, from online forums to television debates and even casual conversations in cafes across London. People who had initially remained neutral started shifting their stance, gradually becoming convinced that something was being hidden, not just by Meghan, but potentially by the royal family as well. The damage wasn't just personal anymore, it was institutional. Meghan's refusal to respond was now cutting deeply into the credibility of the monarchy, creating the impression that the palace itself might be involved in concealing a scandal of historic proportions. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere became increasingly tense, almost suffocating, as senior aides moved quickly through long corridors, exchanging worried glances and holding quiet, urgent discussions behind closed doors. There were no formal meetings, no official statements released, only a growing sense of pressure that seemed to tighten with each passing hour. Initially, the palace attempted to handle the situation using traditional methods, relying on established relationships with the press to quietly suppress the spread of the story. Efforts were made to discourage British outlets from republishing the article, with the hope that limiting its exposure domestically would allow it to fade into the background. But the world had changed, and information no longer respected borders. The more the palace tried to contain the narrative, the more suspicious it appeared to the public. Instead of calming the situation, these behind-the-scenes efforts were interpreted as proof that something was being hidden, turning the royal family's actions into part of the controversy itself. The attempt to silence the story became one of the biggest mistakes, as it fed directly into the growing belief that the monarchy was covering up a truth too damaging to reveal. As the situation spiraled further, public sentiment began to shift dramatically. The same voices that once defended the crown were now questioning its integrity, accusing it of prioritizing its image over honesty. The idea that the royal family might be involved in preserving a false narrative to protect its reputation spread rapidly, eroding trust that had been built over generations. The dignity of the throne, once seen as unshakable, was now being openly challenged, discussed, and even mocked in public spaces. Every hour that passed without clarity seemed to deepen the crisis, turning what began as speculation into a full-scale reputational threat. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Montecito, Meghan remained distant from the chaos she had helped create, sitting comfortably in her private space while carefully observing how events were unfolding. She declined every attempt at direct communication from London, allowing calls to go unanswered and letters to remain unopened, effectively cutting herself off while still controlling the narrative from a distance. At the same time, carefully curated images of her began appearing in the media, portraying her as exhausted, isolated, and under immense pressure, reinforcing the image of a victim caught in the middle of a relentless storm. This contrast between silence and subtle visibility created a powerful psychological effect. On one hand, she refused to engage directly, maintaining her distance from the accusations, but on the other, she ensured that the public continued to see her, continued to feel sympathy, and continued to question what was really happening behind the scenes. The strategy placed the royal family in an impossible position. If they chose to defend her publicly, they risked attaching their credibility to a situation they could not fully verify themselves. But if they demanded proof or questioned her claims, it could be framed as an attack, reinforcing the narrative of a powerful institution targeting one of its own. No matter which path they took, they would appear either complicit or cruel. The monarchy, known for its control and composure, was now trapped in a situation where every move carried risk, and every delay made things worse. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, it felt as though the narrative was no longer being controlled from within the palace walls, but from a quiet mansion thousands of miles away. But just when it seemed like the monarchy was trapped in a situation with no clear escape, one critical miscalculation began to surface, a flaw in the strategy that would slowly start to shift the balance of power. The assumption had been that the palace would continue reacting cautiously, relying on media control and quiet diplomacy, hesitant to take any bold or unconventional step. What was overlooked, however, was the presence of someone within the royal structure who did not operate under those limitations, someone who neither feared public backlash nor relied on public approval to make decisions. While confusion and hesitation spread among advisors and officials, a very different kind of response was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. Princess Anne, known for her directness and unwavering sense of duty, stepped into the situation without any need for announcements or public positioning. There were no dramatic entrances or visible signs of urgency, yet her presence alone marked a clear turning point. Where others saw a complex public relations crisis, she saw a problem that required a decisive and practical solution, one that did not depend on narratives, opinions, or speculation, but on something far more concrete, the truth itself. And had never been someone to engage in public disputes or media-driven arguments. She understood that responding to noise with more noise only deepened the chaos. Instead, she focused on the core issue that everyone else seemed to be circling around but not directly addressing. The silence coming from Montecito was not, in her view, an act of helplessness or confusion. It was intentional, and more importantly, it was strategic. With years of experience navigating both public scrutiny and private pressures, she recognized a pattern that others had missed. When someone possesses the ability to end a damaging narrative instantly but chooses not to, it often indicates that the narrative itself is being used as leverage. This wasn't just about clearing a name anymore. It was about control, about forcing a reaction, and about shifting responsibility onto the royal family. And understood that stepping into that dynamic without a clear plan would only strengthen the position of the one controlling the silence. In a brief but impactful exchange with senior advisors, she made her stance clear, cutting through layers of uncertainty with a level of clarity that immediately changed the tone of the discussion. There would be no concessions, no carefully worded statements designed to appease public opinion, and no attempts to negotiate through the media. For Anne, the dignity of the crown was not something to be managed through perception alone. It had to be protected through decisive action. She dismissed the idea of reaching out directly, knowing that any form of communication could be recorded, interpreted, and potentially used to reinforce the very narrative that was causing the damage. Engaging directly would mean stepping into a situation where the terms were already controlled by someone else, and that was a risk she was not willing to take. Instead, she chose a completely different path, one that avoided the visible battlefield altogether. If the situation had been built around uncertainty and speculation, then the only way to dismantle it was to remove that uncertainty at its source. The focus shifted toward obtaining something that could not be debated, manipulated, or reinterpreted, the original verifiable evidence. This wasn't about winning a public argument, it was about ending it entirely. And to do that, the approach had to be precise, controlled, and completely outside the usual channels. No reliance on public institutions, no involvement of authorities that could complicate the situation, and no traceable steps that could lead back to the palace. It required a method that was both discreet and effective, one that operated beyond the reach of media narratives and public scrutiny. A quiet operation began to take shape, built not on visibility but on precision and confidentiality. The objective was singular and unmistakable: locate and secure the original medical records that could definitively answer every question being asked. These were not documents that could be substituted or recreated. They existed in a specific place, maintained under strict conditions, and protected by systems designed to preserve their authenticity. By targeting the source rather than the surface-level conflict, and was shifting the entire dynamic of the situation. The narrative would no longer depend on who spoke first or who controlled the headlines. It would depend solely on what the evidence revealed. And once that evidence was in hand, the balance of power would no longer favor speculation or silence. It would favor truth, in its most undeniable form. What followed was not a public move or a visible escalation, but a carefully structured operation that unfolded entirely in the shadows, far away from cameras, headlines, and political oversight. This approach was deliberate, because involving official channels like law enforcement or legal authorities would have created records, procedures, and potential leaks that could expose the palace to even greater risk. Instead, a completely separate network was activated, one that operated beyond traditional systems and relied on individuals trained for precision, discretion, and adaptability. These were not ordinary agents, but highly experienced private investigators, many of them former intelligence operatives who understood how to navigate complex environments without leaving a trace. Their involvement ensured that the mission would remain invisible, carried out with a level of professionalism that matched the sensitivity of what was at stake. The instruction given to them was clear and uncompromising: locate the original medical file, avoid any form of digital interference, leave no evidence behind, and return only with the physical proof. The strategy itself reflected a deep understanding of the situation. The focus was never on the Montecito mansion, despite it being the center of public attention, and recognized that any evidence kept there could easily be hidden, altered, or even replaced if necessary. The true value lay elsewhere, in a place that could not be influenced by personal control, the hospital where the births had taken place. Medical institutions are bound by strict legal requirements to maintain original, signed documentation for extended periods, preserving records in their most authentic form. These archives, often stored securely and systematically, represent a level of credibility that cannot be easily challenged or dismissed. By directing the operation toward that location, and ensured that the outcome would be based on verifiable facts rather than assumptions or manipulated narratives. As the team moved into position, the nature of their work became evident. This was not a dramatic mission filled with visible action, but a precise and methodical process driven by planning and timing. One operative, dressed in a professional suit, took on the role of a federal medical inspector, using this identity to engage with the hospital's administrative structure and create a distraction at the highest level. Meetings were arranged, attention was redirected, and the focus of key personnel shifted away from the areas that mattered most. At the same time, two other operatives, working under carefully constructed identities, approached the lower levels of the facility where the physical archives were stored. These areas, often overlooked by routine activity, contained thousands of sealed records organized systematically, each one representing a piece of documented history. The environment itself added to the pressure of the operation. The basement storage area was quiet, enclosed, and filled with the distinct scent of preserved paper and clinical materials, creating an atmosphere that felt both controlled and isolating. Rows of shelves extended in every direction, each holding countless files labeled with codes and identifiers that required careful navigation. The operatives relied not on digital tools, which could trigger security systems, but on pre-obtained information and manual cross-referencing to locate the exact section they needed. Every movement had to be calculated, every sound minimized, because even the smallest disruption could attract attention. There were no second chances in a situation like this. Any mistake could expose the entire operation and create consequences far beyond the immediate objective. As time passed, the tension intensified, not through action but through the constant awareness of risk. A security guard's footsteps echoed faintly through a nearby corridor, a reminder that they were operating within a controlled environment where discovery would have immediate repercussions. The team adjusted instantly, blending into the surroundings, pausing until the moment passed. It was a test of patience and discipline, where success depended not on speed but on precision and restraint. Finally, guided by their information, they reached the specific archive section corresponding to the relevant time period. The final barrier stood before them, not in the form of a complex system, but a simple locked cabinet that held within it the answer to a global controversy. With steady hands and practiced skill, the lock was opened quietly, revealing rows of sealed envelopes inside. Each one represented a different case, a different story, but only one of them carried the weight they were searching for. When the correct file was identified, marked with the appropriate name and secured with official seals, the significance of the moment became clear. This was not just a document. It was the focal point of an international crisis, the piece of evidence that could confirm or dismantle everything that had been said. Carefully, without disturbing the surrounding files, the operative removed the envelope and secured it in a protective case designed to prevent any form of external interference. The cabinet was restored to its original state, leaving no indication that anything had been touched. The operation, from start to finish, remained invisible, its success defined by the absence of any trace. And as the team exited just as quietly as they had entered, the balance of the entire situation began to shift, because the truth, once hidden behind layers of speculation and silence, was now moving steadily toward the one person determined to reveal it. The extraction of the file was only the beginning, because what followed had to be handled with even greater precision, ensuring that the evidence reached its destination without passing through any system that could expose its movement. The envelope did not travel through commercial airports, nor did it pass through routine customs checks where documentation might be logged or questioned. Instead, it was transferred through a tightly controlled route, placed aboard a private aircraft operating without any visible diplomatic markings, moving silently across the Atlantic under the cover of night. Every step of that journey was designed to maintain complete discretion, because the value of the file depended not just on its contents, but on its authenticity remaining unquestioned. By the time it reached London, there were no records, no trails, and no indication that such a critical piece of evidence had ever left its original location. 24 hours later, the same manila envelope rested on a solid oak desk inside a private office, far removed from the chaos of public speculation. The room itself was quiet, insulated from the noise that continued to dominate headlines and social media discussions around the world. Standing alone in that space, Princess Anne faced the final stage of the process. Her attention was fixed entirely on the sealed envelope, its red wax stamp still intact, representing not just official documentation but the culmination of everything that had unfolded over the past days. Outside those walls, millions of voices continued to argue, accuse, and speculate, but inside, there was only stillness, a moment suspended between uncertainty and revelation. At that exact same time, thousands of miles away in Montecito, a completely different scene was unfolding. Meghan was preparing for what she believed would be the turning point of the entire situation. Her movements were deliberate, her appearance carefully arranged to reflect the image she intended to present, a composed yet visibly strained figure, someone who had endured pressure and was now ready to respond. She adjusted her surroundings with equal attention, placing a concealed camera in a position that captured the entrance of the room, ensuring that any unexpected arrival would be recorded from the perfect angle. Everything suggested that she was anticipating a direct confrontation, expecting representatives from the royal family to arrive, possibly with demands, questions, or even accusations. In her mind, that moment would provide exactly what she needed, a powerful visual narrative that could shift public perception instantly. Back in London, however, events were moving in a completely different direction. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic arrival, and no opportunity for the kind of scene that had been carefully prepared. Instead, the focus remained entirely on the document resting on the desk. Anne reached for a letter opener, its polished surface reflecting the soft light of the room, and with a steady motion, she broke the wax seal that had kept the contents hidden. The sound was subtle, almost insignificant, yet it marked the moment when speculation would finally give way to fact. As the envelope opened, the weight of uncertainty that had surrounded the situation for days began to collapse into a single point, the truth contained within those pages. She removed the documents slowly, revealing a stack of official records filled with detailed medical information, charts, and handwritten notes. Each page represented a layer of verification, a record maintained with precision and accountability. As she began to read, her focus sharpened, scanning through technical details, timelines, and recorded observations. The process was methodical, each page turning with quiet deliberation as she moved closer to the final confirmation. There were no interruptions, no external distractions, only the steady progression through information that would ultimately define the outcome of the entire situation. When she reached the final pages, where the most critical confirmations were documented, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The question that had fueled global debate for days was about to be answered in the most definitive way possible. Every rumor, every theory, every accusation that had circulated across the world now stood against the reality recorded in those documents. The moment carried a weight that extended far beyond the room itself, because whatever was written there would not only settle the controversy but reshape the narrative that had already taken hold in the public mind. As her eyes moved across the final lines of the document, the answer that the entire world had been waiting for became unmistakably clear, and it was not what the chaos outside had been building toward. The records were precise, consistent, and completely unambiguous. There was no indication of any surrogacy arrangement, no conflicting data, and no irregularities that could support the rumors that had spread so aggressively. Every detail, from the early medical observations to the final delivery records, aligned perfectly, forming a complete and verifiable account that confirmed one simple truth. Meghan had carried the pregnancies herself, and the children had been born exactly as officially stated. The legitimacy that had been questioned so intensely was, in reality, never in doubt. For a brief moment, the significance of that confirmation settled into the silence of the room, but it did not bring the sense of relief that many might have expected. Instead, it raised a far more unsettling question, one that immediately shifted the entire perspective of the situation. If the records were this clear, if the proof had existed all along in such a definitive form, then why had it been withheld? Why allow a narrative built on doubt and accusation to grow to such a scale when it could have been stopped instantly? That contradiction carried more weight than the original allegations themselves, because it suggested that the silence was not a reaction to uncertainty, but a deliberate choice. The realization began to take shape gradually, connecting the sequence of events in a way that revealed a much more calculated pattern. The article that had triggered the crisis, the carefully maintained silence, the absence of any immediate denial, and the way public attention had been allowed to escalate, all of it started to align as parts of a larger strategy rather than isolated decisions. The controversy had not simply been allowed to happen, it had been sustained, guided, and amplified through inaction. By withholding proof, the situation had been given time to evolve into something far more impactful, drawing in public emotion, media attention, and institutional pressure. This perspective transformed the meaning of everything that had occurred. The silence was no longer just an absence of response. It had functioned as a tool, shaping perception and influencing reactions on a massive scale. The longer it continued, the more deeply it affected the credibility of the monarchy, placing increasing pressure on the palace to respond in a way that could potentially compromise its own position. Every unanswered question, every circulating theory, and every rising demand for clarity had contributed to a scenario where any move by the royal family carried significant risk. What made this realization particularly striking was the level of precision it implied. Allowing such a sensitive issue to escalate required confidence that the truth, when eventually revealed, would remain intact and undeniable. It suggested an understanding of how public narratives form and how they can be influenced not just through action, but through carefully timed inaction. The situation had effectively been shaped into a test of response, one where the reactions of others would determine the next phase of the narrative. At that moment, the focus shifted entirely from the original question of legitimacy to the intention behind the silence itself. The controversy was no longer about whether the children were born through surrogacy, because that had already been resolved. Instead, it became about why such a damaging narrative had been allowed to grow unchecked, and what purpose that served within the broader context of the unfolding events. The answer to that question carried implications far beyond the immediate situation, because it pointed toward a level of strategic thinking that turned public perception into a powerful instrument, capable of influencing not just opinion, but the actions of an entire institution. The implications of that realization did not stay contained within the room for long, because once the truth of the records was clear, the entire structure of the situation had to be re-evaluated from the ground up. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward controversy built on allegations and denial was now revealing itself as something far more complex, where timing, perception, and silence had played roles just as important as facts. Princess Anne remained still for a moment, the documents resting in her hands, as if weighing not only what was written on the pages but also what those pages represented in the larger, unfolding narrative. Outside the walls of that office, the world was still divided, still arguing, still reacting to information that was already incomplete in its understanding of what had truly happened. But inside, the foundation of that uncertainty had already collapsed. The verified medical records had removed the original accusation entirely, leaving no space for ambiguity on the core issue that had driven the global frenzy. Yet instead of closing the matter cleanly, the confirmation had exposed a deeper layer of consequence. Because once the allegation itself was disproven, attention naturally shifted toward the chain of events that had allowed it to dominate public discourse for so long. The question was no longer about legitimacy, but about influence. How a single narrative, even one based on false assumptions, had been allowed to grow into a worldwide crisis without immediate correction. The silence that had once seemed passive was now being reinterpreted as something far more deliberate, something that had shaped perception rather than simply endured it. Within the palace, this shift in understanding carried immediate weight. Advisors and senior figures who had been focused on containment and media management were now forced to confront a more uncomfortable reality. The issue was no longer about defending against accusations, but about understanding why those accusations had reached such intensity before any factual response had been introduced. The traditional methods of handling controversy, carefully worded statements, controlled leaks, and quiet pressure on media channels, no longer felt sufficient to explain or control what had already unfolded. The situation had moved beyond reactive management and into something that required structural analysis of how the narrative had formed in the first place. At the same time, the global public response began to fragment again, but in a different direction than before. Those who had once demanded proof now found themselves reassessing their earlier conclusions, realizing that much of what they had believed had been shaped by incomplete information and emotional escalation rather than verified fact. However, the correction did not bring calm in the way many expected. Instead, it created a new wave of discussion focused on intent, questioning how such a large-scale misunderstanding could have been sustained for so long without interruption. The story was no longer simply about one family or one controversy. It had become an example of how quickly perception can overpower reality when left unchecked. Inside Montecito, the situation felt increasingly distant from the narrative that was now unfolding elsewhere. The controlled environment, the carefully maintained silence, and the expectation of confrontation all seemed to belong to a version of events that was no longer aligned with what had actually been confirmed. Yet even as the external narrative shifted, the internal consequences of what had been set in motion could not be reversed. The strategy that had relied on absence of response had already achieved its effect, shaping global attention in a way that extended far beyond the original issue. And now, with the truth officially established, what remained was not resolution, but accountability for how the entire sequence had been allowed to unfold in the first place. Princess Anne closed the file slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a point of decision. Because even though one question had been answered, the broader situation it revealed was still in motion. The focus had shifted from proving what was true to understanding how truth itself had been manipulated, delayed, and used as part of a larger psychological and media-driven framework. And in that realization, the matter was no longer just about a controversy that had been resolved. It had become about the consequences of letting perception lead reality for too long without challenge. By the time the situation reached its final stage, it was no longer defined by the original accusation, but by everything that had unfolded around it: the silence, the speculation, the global reaction, and the irreversible shift in public perception. The verified records had already settled the core question, yet what lingered was the aftermath of how that question had been allowed to dominate the world for so long. Princess Anne understood that even when truth is clear, its impact depends entirely on how and when it is revealed, and in this case, timing had become as significant as evidence itself. The documents in front of her no longer represented uncertainty, they represented closure on one level, and exposure of a deeper problem on another. The royal institution now faced a reality that extended beyond defending against rumors. It had to confront the consequences of a narrative that had spiraled far beyond its original scope, influenced not just by media speculation but by strategic silence that had amplified its reach. The public response, once chaotic and divided, was beginning to settle into a more reflective state, where attention shifted from what is true to why did this become so large before truth was introduced. That question carried more weight than the initial scandal, because it pointed toward a structural vulnerability in how modern information spreads and how institutions respond under pressure. Inside Montecito, the contrast between expectation and outcome became increasingly difficult to ignore. What had been anticipated as a confrontation, a demand, or a forced public exchange never materialized in the way it had been imagined. Instead, the absence of direct engagement created a different kind of outcome, one where the narrative was shaped externally rather than through direct dialogue. The carefully constructed anticipation of a dramatic response was replaced by a quieter, more indirect resolution that left less room for performance and more space for interpretation of intent. As the global discourse continued to evolve, it became clear that the most lasting impact of the entire situation was not the rumor itself, but the mechanism through which it had grown. The combination of speculation, delayed clarification, and strategic silence had demonstrated how quickly perception can scale beyond control when left unchallenged. Even after the truth was confirmed, the memory of the controversy remained embedded in public awareness, not because of what was proven, but because of how long uncertainty was allowed to define the narrative. Princess Anne placed the file down, not as an ending, but as a record of something larger than a single dispute. The matter was no longer about individuals alone. It had become an example of how fragile institutional trust can become when information flows faster than verification. And while one chapter had closed with factual clarity, another had opened, focused not on accusation or defense, but on the deeper challenge of restoring stability after a narrative has already taken control of the public imagination. In that quiet conclusion, there was no dramatic victory or final confrontation, only the sober recognition that in the modern world, truth alone is not always enough to prevent chaos, and timing often determines whether clarity arrives before or after damage is already done.